Islamic heritage and human rights violation by Saudi Arabia at the United Nations. For this conference, we have 4 distinguished speakers. On my right, Mrs. Tina Foster, which is Counsel. Just after, Mr. Kumail Razvi, Director of Political Outreach. At the far side, Mrs. Catherine Shakdam, which is Publicist, and Mr. Sajjad Lakhani, Director of Strategical Planning. Before giving the floor to Mrs. Foster, I would like to ask our speakers to sign our gold book and to receive a little present.
Thank you.
It is a book, Cartooning for Peace, which was published this year.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
So each speaker will speak about 5-10 minutes, and we'll leave the floor open for question at the end of everyone. Mrs. Foster, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Tobias. Okay, great. Thank you, Tobias, for that welcome, and thank you very much for the gift. My name is Tina Foster. I am an international human rights lawyer, and I'm here today on behalf of Baqee organization, which is based in Chicago, New York. I'm sorry, Chicago, U.S. and Illinois. I'm from New York, so a little biased there. I'm proudly here on behalf of this organization. My colleagues and I are here in Geneva to raise an often overlooked issue that has not been reported in the media, and it has not been raised on an international platform until now. And that is specifically Saudi Arabia's destruction of Islamic heritage and persecution, religious persecution of Muslims who do not ascribe to the state-sponsored doctrine which Saudi Arabia mandates. We are one voice in a sea of voices regarding human rights violations by Saudi Arabia. And we recognize that, but we feel that this is an overlooked issue, primarily because there is a certain bias in Western media to focus on those issues which are most shocking to citizens of one's own country. And this issue of Saudi Arabia's persecution of Muslims, we need to put in perspective of the fact that Saudi Arabia, the doctrine of Wahhabism that is mandated in the state-sponsored religion of Saudi Arabia is actually in a minority of Muslims. There are 1.6 billion Muslims across the world, and Saudi Arabia's self-proclaimed being the custodian of the holy sites is something that they have touted all over the world, and often say that they are non-discriminatory, they allow Muslims from all over the world to visit. But what we in fact know from our research and from the first-hand accounts that we have heard is that in fact Saudi Arabia does not tolerate any other form of Islamic worship other than their own ideology. We feel it's important to raise this because it has not been raised enough in the media, and recent events have demonstrated that Saudi Arabia's internal policies, recognizing it is a sovereign nation, have effects beyond their borders. Whether it is a journalist kidnapped from a consulate in a European country, or whether it is a national of another country traveling, we see that that the Saudi government can act with impunity in a variety of areas. And one of the areas that I think needs to be highlighted for especially Western media is that Muslims are not immune from this persecution, and in fact, the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world feel this very deeply. my colleagues and I were amongst many NGOs that came to Geneva today in advance of the Universal Periodic Review of Saudi Arabia, which is the UN Human Rights Council's every 4 to 5 years, they review every country's record on particular human rights issues, and member states of the UN are invited to make recommendations and advance questions to Saudi Arabia. The actual Universal Periodic Review will happen in early November for Saudi Arabia, but the states that are preparing their recommendations in advance questions are doing so right now. And so what we are trying to do is educate member states about this issue that is of concern to Muslims across the world, and indeed trying to advocate for very specific changes. The specific actions which we have requested that member states advance, our key recommendations are that Saudi Arabia allow women pilgrims, and obviously their own citizens, as well as women pilgrims from other nations, to visit the holy places without interference, to permit Muslims who do not believe or conform to the state-endorsed religion to visit and perform religious rituals at heritage sites, to remove signs which are posted routinely at the holy places that encourage violence against non-conforming Muslims, and to repair and to rebuild some of the most important sites which have been destroyed by Saudi Arabia. As a Western human rights lawyer, I was really shocked to learn that 95%, between 90 and 95% of the Islamic historical heritage sites in Saudi Arabia have already been destroyed. My colleagues are going to give you a little bit more background about that, but you know, we're talking about not insignificant sites. The house of the Prophet himself has been demolished, and unfortunately a bathroom has been put on that spot, and it is symbolic of the attitude of the Saudi government towards what they view as idolatry in supplicating at these sites. I would also like to say that my colleagues here today, they're going to give you background and information and stick to the facts, but they have all personally been affected by these policies. You know, there isn't anyone from the community that has not experienced difficulty would be an understatement, but horrific abuses, in fact, of pilgrims visiting on Hajj and Umrah in Saudi Arabia. In conducting the research that we did in preparation for the report, which we've submitted to the United Nations, copies of which are provided to you, interviewed dozens of people who had reported abuses, including detention and beatings. And, you know, in general, there are police, religious police that are stationed around these sites that are extremely aggressive. And if it is thought that you are not part of the established Saudi-mandated religion, you will be told to move on, not to pray there, and that, in fact, your beliefs are wrong. There have been threats. So we have a lot of firsthand accounts of the type of abuses, but my colleagues have experienced firsthand in Saudi Arabia on their visits. And we're also going to hear from a journalist perspective, my friend Catherine, who's been banned from Saudi Arabia for advocating for religious freedoms in Saudi Arabia. You know, this is not a tourist destination. We're not talking about something minor. We are talking about 1.6 billion Muslims who have a religious obligation to visit these sites. And as the self-proclaimed custodians of these sites, the Saudi government routinely represents that it's fulfilling its duties, but in fact, that is incorrect. I'm going to turn it over now to my friend Sajjad Lakhani, who's going to discuss the Baqee organization and who we are. And my friend Kumail Razvi is going to then talk about the sites themselves that we're talking about and the destruction, what they were before, what they are now. And then Catherine is going to give us the media perspective. Is that?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Tina. And hello to everybody.
Yep, you're good.
Yeah. Tina was very explicit in speaking about what we did today. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about our organization so that you have a pretty good idea of how long we've been working on this issue. And we would like to get a clearer picture that our organization is very focused on its goals. We are Al-Baqee organization is an independent, grassroots, volunteer-based organization. It was established in 2007 after the Askarian shrines' horrific destruction. We took action against it, and we decided to create an organization in 2007. And this organization consists of a coalition of American Muslims who have a greater freedom of expression in the West. And one of our main goals was to bring attention to the systematic destruction and desecration of the shrines, rosas, as we call it, cemeteries, and especially Baqee Cemetery. And the main thing was that we were not hearing any opposition, any voice towards it, which was giving them more credence to go further on destroying it. So as an organization, we decided to raise our voice, raising our voice against tyranny, brutality, and atrocities that is done by this regime under the name of Islam, which is totally false because they have a very dogmatic view of Islam, and they're trying to impose that view on the rest of the Muslim world. Al-Baqee organization by itself is the voice for the voiceless. It is making sure that the rest of the majority of the Muslims are heard very clearly through our efforts, because we do get the emails, we do get the letters from them, we do get the support from them, exhorting us on, saying that we are on the right track. The most important thing out of our organization is we want to make sure there is no further destruction of shrines, cemeteries, and other holy sites. And that's around the world, actually. And especially in Saudi Arabia, where over 90% of Islamic heritage has been destroyed already. Unfortunately, 90%, and not one word in the Western media or anywhere else in Muslim countries. So what we started was a grassroots organization that started with educating the youth. In fact, our seniors had forgotten also what it was, because Al-Baqee Cemetery was destroyed in 1925, and the centennial is coming up pretty soon. And we decided to make a lot of noise on that to make sure that the world hears that the destruction is still going on and we need to stop this, because our future generation is in danger of losing its identity and heritage. So that's the most important thing. Our stand basically is cease and desist from further destructions of holy shrines, cemeteries, stop the human rights abuses, which Tina just alluded to, and especially women, and women are not allowed to supplicate, and that is taking from 1.6 billion over 500 million Muslims out of the equation completely. We also want them to restore and rebuild Al-Baqee Cemetery, of course, to its original glory, and the rest of the shrines like Jannatul Ma'ala and other specific shrines like Tina mentioned and alluded to. The main thing is that we know it's a formidable task. It's not going to be easy. This organization is very committed to it. This organization throughout the year is not only doing the advocacy, UN advocacy that we've been doing for the past 2 years, but it's also involved in seminars. It's also involved in a signature event called on Baqee Day, we protest. We protest in front of the Saudi consulate in Washington, D.C. We have recruited many speakers across the spectrum, activists, journalists, politicians, anybody who has freedom of expression, anybody who can talk about human rights, they have incorporated Baqee Cemetery because they understood the cause, and the cause is a symbolic cause that we have, which actually conforms to their cause. So Baqee organization is not limited in its scope. It is a wide expanse and a wide array of scope that is there. So our organization basically is, we want to stop this destruction, wanton destruction. We want to make sure that our women, our people that go supplicates, the pilgrims, are not harassed, not beaten, not tortured. As she said, we have over 1,000 stories confirmed that is an evidentiary stories that we have submitted to the United Nations, some of them out of that. The most important thing out of that is that we would like to make sure Al-Baqee organization is heard throughout the world, and through you, we want to make sure that our cause is well known and is elevated. I will defer to my brother Kumail Razvi for further information.
One more slide. Okay.
Hello, my name is Kumail Razvi. I am the Director of Political Outreach. The topic that I will be discussing in this session is the before and after of some of the cemeteries. So let me begin with, next slide please, the Baqee Cemetery. So as you all have seen, the organization's name is Al-Baqee Organization. It is based off of this particular cemetery, which is named Baqee. The reign of terror of the destruction of heritage has begun with the destruction of this particular cemetery. And we have used this name as a symbol to denote that the atrocities that have occurred in the Islamic world. This is a photograph of approximately in 1925, and this particular cemetery was a well-known cemetery. It's a historical and a religious significance in the history of the architecture as well as from the religious aspect as well. The Ottoman Empire had created it. There were numerous other things that I wanted to, I'll discuss at a offline discussion. So next slide, please. The significance of this cemetery is that the holiest personality in Islam, Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his own son, wife, grandsons, companions, and other friends and martyrs are buried in this particular cemetery. So from an Islamic standpoint, from a religious standpoint, this is one of the holiest sites that you could consider from the religious aspect as well, from a historical aspect, and from a social, educational aspect as well for the given world. And this particular place is completely razed to ground, and I'll show you those pictures in a second. So the people who are buried, I'm just going to name a few of them. Ibrahim, the only son of Prophet. Okay? Fatima, the only daughter of Prophet. She's buried there. His grandsons, Hassan, Imam Ali, Zainul Abidin, as he's also known as, Baqir, and Sadiq. These are the personalities that are buried in there. His companions. And there are numerous other personalities of the Islamic religion are buried in this particular cemetery. Okay? So this particular site requires some attention from the entire Islamic world, as well as from educationalists, as well as from the politicians and media as well. Next slide, please. This is an aerial view of what it is now. Okay? It's a very dire state. That entire area has been desecrated. Okay? Next slide, please. Not only that, as you can see, it's probably a little bit grainy on here, but these pictures are easily accessible on internet. People are actually restricted from coming close to these grave sites and paying respect to these holy personalities. So there are other elements of this aspect of this humanitarian issue that we wanted to highlight in the United Nations. That is, you're not only destroying the heritage, but you're also restricting people to practice their beliefs, practice their freedom of expression. So we wanted to highlight this, and that's why we're here. Next slide, please. I could go on for a very long time, but I wanted to also highlight some of the other important sites that has been destroyed by the kingdom. Okay? The birthplace of Prophet Muhammad has been destroyed and has been now shamefully has been converted into a public washroom. That place holds a very important and sanctity place for a lot of Muslims around the world. And the Wahhabi regime has basically cleared it from the map of the Islamic history. And people who knows, they know. Otherwise, a common person visiting Mecca, they don't even know where that place is. It's a very ironic state. The house of Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, he's a very notable personality in the history of Islam. His house has been completely razed to the ground. There is no signs, there is no indication as to where that place was. And this particular personality in the history of Islam, as in the history of science, has a lot of significance because a lot of subjects were introduced or were basically brought to life during his time. Algebra being one of them, chemistry being one of them. Okay. Jannatul Mu'alla is another site. This is the place where Prophet's father is buried, his uncle is buried, his first wife, Khadija, is buried at. And there are a whole bunch of other personalities there as well. Okay. The tomb of Eve was in Jeddah, is another city in Saudi Arabia that has also been destroyed. Okay. The first lady in the planet Earth. People who don't know, you cannot find out. If you go and look up in the historical books or online, you will not be able to find that tomb. You need to find some different ways, people who have been there for a long time and if they're willing to take you, they'll take you. Otherwise, they risk persecution by the religious police in Saudi Arabia. The mosques of Fatima Zahra, there are other important personalities that has been, the tombs and the shrines have been destroyed. There's a complete list posted on Wikipedia. I provided a link, and if you do get a chance, you can take a look at it. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to talk about from the media aspect and other related issues towards this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Catherine Shakdam, and for the past 3 years, I've worked with Baqee as their publicist. My job essentially has been to try to raise awareness in mainstream media as to issues such as religious freedom, the freedom of practicing one's religion, and in general human rights. And this is something that I find very troubling, especially if we consider the times that we live in and the rise of intolerance in general, not just in religion, but even politically speaking. And I think that our ability to challenge and think and be able to remember who we are in that we are, I think, the sum of our history. And if we do not remember where we come from, it would be very difficult for us to move forward. And I think that in that way, history is very important to us. And this is why, for me, Al-Baqee really strikes a chord in that it has become, in many ways, I think, ground zero for acts of intolerance towards not just the religion of Islam, but I think for all religions in general, because as my colleagues mentioned, we're not just talking about the Islamic heritage, we're talking about the world religious heritage, and that such a site as the Tomb of Eve, for example, would strike a chord, I believe, in the Judeo-Christian world. And so many sites and so many, I think, acts of barbarism have gone unnoticed because mainstream, I don't think, has held up to its end of the bargain in that they have defaulted on their responsibility. And this is something that I found particularly worrying Especially sitting here in Geneva, where it is the seat of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and yet people are unwilling to discuss issues related to human rights, related to religious freedom and freedom in general. And I think that the Saudi Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is, we have to remember, an absolute theocracy, stands, I think, testimony of our silence and what happens when we keep silent. And the kind of abuses that happens when people, by sin of omission, decide to look away, hoping that our worst nightmare would not come true. They have come true. They have come true, in Al-Baqee Cemetery, and they are coming true. What we see today, this destruction, the absolute, destruction, there is nothing else but rubbles of Al-Baqee Cemetery, has become in many ways, for me, a very real representation of what is happening to us as people in our, lack of courage in defending other people's culture, right to identity, right to think for themselves and decide what it is that they want to believe. I think it goes beyond just standing up for 25% of the world population Muslim. It's for everybody. And I think I would like to think that given what happened in the 1930s and what is happening today in the light of radicalism and terrorism, that we should learn and we should have learned our lesson, but we haven't because we keep silence. And it is terrible to see that, only when terrible acts of vengeance, such as that we have witnessed by the alleged murder of a very well-known and prominent Saudi journalist, only then do we see Saudi Arabia being held into account. It's terrible to think that, religious acts, religious oppression and acts of barbarism have been committed for over a century, and only now are we speaking up. So I'm glad that we are. I'm just sad that we had to reach such a state of devolution that, it's only now that we are allowed to speak up. So I'm hoping, really hoping that Al-Baqee will somehow carry a flag for more discussions, because essentially this is what we're looking for. We're not looking so much to condemn, but what we're trying to do is to find a solution together and to challenge the status quo, and to defend our right to think, because essentially if we really think about it, which is a little bit ironic, our ability to think is actually to challenge other people and to take the risk of offending them. But it is a good thing to actually challenge the status quo and be willing to look beyond and think beyond what we are today to have a common future. And I think that Saudi Arabia stands, a testimony of what not to do and how not to do it. And as Tina has mentioned earlier, I think all of us here in this panel have actually felt the bite of oppression when it comes to Saudi Arabia. I myself, I'm on a Saudi blacklist where I'm not allowed to go to perform the Hajj pilgrimage because I had the audacity to actually argue religious freedom. I think there's an irony there that is actually missed on Saudi Arabia, but this is the reality of today. But again, mainstream media is not really willing to acknowledge this reality, even though we talk about terrorism at length, but never about the actual reality of terrorism in Saudi Arabia, such as is promoted by Wahhabism. So I would like to thank everybody for being here today. And if anyone has any more questions.
Thank you very much for all your remarks. I have maybe a first question, and then we can open the floor for further questions. Maybe first a bit question is, what are the reasons given by the Saudi government for these destructions? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, could there be a link between what happened in Syria, in Palmyra, or other countries around?
I just want to read from the official Saudi national report, which it was just released in advance of the Universal Periodic Review. It says that, there's an entire section devoted to serving and caring for the two holy mosques. It says the kingdom devotes considerable attention to the two holy mosques, mobilizing all the resources necessary to serve them and the pilgrims. It goes on to say that the kingdom spares no effort to enable Muslims from around the world to perform the pilgrimage rites without discrimination, regardless of political or ideological considerations. So, there's essentially a denial that this is going on, and one of the things that they talk about when they talk about what a great job they're doing in facilitating pilgrimages, they talk about the kingdom is currently witnessing the largest expansion of the two holy mosques in the history of Islam at a cost of more than 7 billion rials, the equivalent of 18 billion US dollars. The expansion will double the capacity and enable pilgrims, of whom there were some, I think this was 2.5 million in 2017, from all over the world to perform their religious rites and observances. So their interpretation of expanding and commercializing the Hajj is what I think is part of what they're using as a justification to actually destroy sites. There is also an ideological component to this, which the sites say that it's essentially the doctrine that they're ascribing to is that any type of supplication at these sites is idolatry, and that's an ideological reason as well.
I'm going to take question number 2, and thank you, because it's actually an excellent question. And absolutely, yes, there is definitely a correlation there. The issue that we keep we refuse to look at it, and I think it's a very strong desire to not look at it rather than ignorance. Is that yes, there is a direct link in between the dogma, it is a dogma that is coming out of Saudi Arabia, and actually the radicalism that is being professed by such groups as ISIL or Al-Qaeda or others who have been actually, responsible for the explosion of the Buddha, for example, in Afghanistan, or the targeting of Palmyra in Syria, and other sites across not just Syria, but Iraq as well, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen. Many sites have been destroyed of historical significance, and that have linked not just to Islam, but as well the Judeo-Christian world. And it's definitely something that is terribly worrying, because there is, because of our silence, this has empowered those ideologues that are arguing the remapping of history for the sake of imprinting a new identity and a belief system, a very, very dogmatic worldview. And this is our problem. We are standing for pluralism and the right for people to believe or not believe, but to do so with the understanding of history and the empowerment of knowledge. And I think this is particularly important today. Again, I do believe that United Nations' first mandate is to actually defend culture, to defend the right to think and to challenge. And if we do not know and we forget where we come from, it's very difficult to do. I think we all can remember, for example, how terrible a tragedy it was to lose, the Library of Alexandria to a great fire, and we're still recovering from this. So can you imagine if in 100 years Saudi Arabia could destroy 95% of the Islamic world heritage? What would happen in another 100 years if you keep silent? Nothing will be left, and God only knows what belief would then rise from the deserts of Najd, of Saudi Arabia. It's a terrible thing to think, and I refuse to think it. I do not want to imagine it, and I'm hoping that people will wake up today and actually protect our history. It is our history. This is not just the history of a few people. It is everybody's history, and it's important that we do protect it and stand up for it.
Do you have some question? Please just introduce your name and organization.
Hello, I'm Dr. Hussain. I'm the consultant psychiatrist based in Kashmir. I just basically want to highlight, just basically mention that about all of the points that we raised here, that they were already highlighted by United Nations in the Arab Human Development Report 2002. When the Kofi Annan was working at that time, and they specifically highlighted 3 deficiencies, that was deficiencies relating to freedom, empowerment of women, and knowledge, which are the 3 areas they have strongly recommended that the Arabs needs to work on in order to develop effectively as a society, which I think is that all these areas that we discussed do come under. So it means that it has been highlighted, it has been put forward, by recognized by them, and we just need to reiterate to them again that this is the part of the same issue.
Sure, I'm going to ask my colleagues to also comment on this, but that particular report is talking about, in general, society, the development of the Arab society. What we are talking about, a more specific aspect of the religious connotation to that as well. And it's not just Arab world, it's the entire world. Women are being affected by the doctrines, by the enforcement of the policies and procedures that they are putting the rest of the Muslims on. And that's the challenge that is different. And that's what Catherine and Tina are highlighting, that those aspects have not been talked about and discussed in any of the reports in the past.
I think it's very telling that when you go to the United Nations and you hear people speak, all these NGOs, a lot of NGOs from the global north, essentially, you hear what is what for them is resonant, which is, when I told people I was coming to Geneva to advocate for human rights in regard to Saudi Arabia, everyone immediately says, well, yes, they treat women horribly there, and aren't they so intolerant of Christians and anyone that's not Muslim? And we feel it's extremely important for the world to know that they are the folks in Saudi Arabia that are have been, self-proclaimed. They've stolen our identity on the international stage. I mean, the 1.6 billion Muslims out there. The Saudi regime is the minority, not the rest of the world. And if this was happening, the Buddhas of Bamiyan is a good example. When there are terrorists that are attacking significant sites, the Western world speaks about it and condemns those acts. But when we are talking about Islamic sites, everyone assumes that because it's Saudi Arabia, that they must be respectful of those sites, and that why would Saudi Arabia want to destroy Islamic sites? It's a shock to tell people that 95% of those sites have been destroyed. So I think that it's of a different flavor, because people love to point the finger and say, you don't respect women's rights, you don't respect this, you don't respect that, which are things that might resonate to somebody in the global north. But for a lot of Muslims, this is a huge issue. So I just want to make that point. Do you want to say something?
Just to add on very little, 2 sentences, is that this is a systematic wanton destruction of Islamic heritage that has been carried out according to this strategic planning. What you referred to is a report from United Nations and stuff like that over an overall general society of women and how they're treated, like driving and this and that. And the minute they give you a little, glossed over report or something like that, everybody's happy. Yeah, they did that. But actually, Saudi Arabia's dogmatic view, the cult that they have, is wanton destruction, is wanton. The identity of Muslims is being totally whitewashed. And that's what we're afraid of. Today we can understand because we come from a little bit a generation that understood it and our parents taught us. What about, like Catherine said, 100 years from now? Where are all these young people are going to go? What ideology are going to have later on? We don't know. So we want to stop this right now. It's totally different than what you said.
The only thing important to mention about the
Aban Hussein, a freelance journalist. My question is, who does Al-Baqee organization represent? And why are you so concerned about Al-Baqee cemetery? As we understand, the domes were on the Al-Baqee cemetery in the time of the Ottomans. So why is it so important to rebuild it, to to that time?
I'm going to take the question. I'm first going to answer what you asked regarding who do we speak for. I think it's the silent and silenced majority. And I think this is a point that has been made, during this press conference, is that we're talking about 25% of the world population that has literally been silenced by Saudi Arabia for the sake of promoting, one very dogmatic view of Islam, which is Wahhabism. And Wahhabism is actually not even a school of thought within Islam per se. So it's really the fringe of the fringe of the fringe, and yet they are speaking on behalf of, the entirety of the Islamic world, and it's very troubling given what they're doing. Now, why is it so important to restore what we have lost? I would say it's because we have lost it. Because those sites are very dear to a lot of people, and they speak of a history and a teaching that is important because it sits at the very core of what Islam is. And I think what is important to remember is that for the very same reason that people go to temple or churches or whatever site they go to pray or worship, is that we do need as people often to have a link, physical link to the divine, to be able to to feel whole. And if people do not feel the need to pray or do not feel the need to be linked to the divine in whichever way, then it's absolutely fine. But I think we should defend the right of people to do so should they want to. And I think that, again, those sites has been very clear, are very dear to Muslim and very important from a historical standpoint, as in, to remember what it is that the regions actually look like. Because very, very often we tend to forget. I often hear, for example, that Islam is foreign to the Western world. But if you recall correctly, so is Judaism and Christianity, given the fact that they were born exactly where Saudi Arabia is, which is the Middle East. And I think that there's a bias today in that we have forgotten where actually religion come from in terms of our belief system. And it has been so because of the destruction of the world religious side. People have forgotten where they come from, forgotten their history. It's very dangerous because it leads to a lot of prejudice and bias. And I think, racism in a way where people think that God is somehow linked to a certain geography. It is not. Faith is actually universal in that it's empowering people and allowing them to transcend their differences, which is a beautiful thing to defend. I think in the same way that we have to stand for people who choose to not believe in God because it is their prerogative. So I hope I answered your question correctly, and if you guys have something to add.
Just want to add one quick comment. The former Director General of UNESCO had made a very good comment. The heritage sites are the symbols of unity, and they need to be protected for future generations.
One more question. If this is a religious issue, why don't we hear from the religious scholars?
I'm actually going to argue that it's not a religious issue per se, in that I think it has more to do with religious right. It's a human rights issue more than it is a religious issue per se, because we're not trying to defend a certain ideology or a certain school of thought or even worldview. What we're trying to defend is the principle of religious freedom and the right of people to worship, safely. And I don't think it's too much to ask, for people to be able to go to actually prostrate themselves and pray, and not actually have to, to potentially sacrifice their life while doing so. This is the 21st century, and I would like to think that, again, we have learned from past mistakes that, theo-fascism is never a good idea.
I'd also like to add that Catherine's banned from going to Hajj. Okay, so if you are practicing Muslim and you speak out, what you're gambling with is your ability to practice your faith at all, to go on Hajj or Umrah, to go for these pilgrimage. So I don't find it surprising that you don't hear people standing up that are very religious talking about the grave abuses of Saudi Arabia against Islam. I mean, first of all, it's not good for your health to be against the Saudi government. And secondly, it's also a way to be, they hold the key. So I don't think it's shocking that more religious scholars have not spoken about it. I think, we wish more would, but I think it's a predictable result of the fact that it's not open to the public. It's only by the grace of a particular government.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. If we come back to this dogma, which is defended by the Saudi government, how can they compare, on the one hand, that they are destroying the place where the Prophet was born, and on the other hand, if we look at the Green Mosque, how can they say that we are investing and maintaining this place?
So if you look back on the history of when the destruction had started, they were planning to destroy the Green Dome as well. It's just that certain countries at that time had rose up and actually made attempts to challenge the government at that time, and that's what had actually protected the Green Dome. And there are numerous articles and publications out there that clearly illustrate that they had plans to destroy Green Dome as well, and other artifacts. Still have. Exactly, right? And recently, I think about a couple of years ago, there were some plans that were also published to actually further expand the Prophet's Mosque, and as part of that, move some of the the dome and other the grill that you have inside. So they do have plans in that. It's just that particular place has been saved as of now, but we don't know what's going to happen in next 10, 15 years if we keep quiet.
Take this for 1 second.
Go ahead.
I'm glad you asked that question. It's a twofold question, actually. First of all, that there was, in fact, one Muslim country threatened military action against them if they went ahead and destroyed that Green Dome. Second thing is that, make no mistake about it, there are plans on the books to destroy that. Today, what we are doing and what we are sitting and we're trying to wake the Muslim Ummah is because of that. God forbid if they make that move and you don't raise enough voice today, they will be bold enough to do that. And that's what we are trying to do exactly. What we're trying to do is raise so much awareness of this destruction of heritage and our identity that we want to make sure that they don't even think about destroying that. And that's one of the reasons that we are here. Thank you very much for that question. It was very good.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to very quickly say, I'm just going to add very quickly on what they already said, is that it's not only are they actually planning it, but they're actually very open about it. There was an interview that was conducted a few years ago with the then Imam of Mecca, so the main religious figure, who admitted during an interview that yes, they had planned to actually destroy the mosque of the Prophet Muhammad on account that they felt it was bid'ah, it was an act of worship, outside the unity of God, and that they felt it was contrary to Wahhabism, not Islam, Wahhabism, to actually allow for people to gather at the site of the mosque, and they felt uncomfortable with it because they did not feel that it was right. Now, you need to compare this, because some people might make the argument that they are, that it is within their religious right to do so. Now, you need to understand that they do not actually stand on that principle, because, an act of criticism against the king is actually defined as an act of apostasy against God, and is therefore, the person guilty of that offense will have to be put to death by beheading or crucifixion. So I think we need to very much understand the nature of this ideology and why it is that 25% of the world population is living in fear of that one particular family, because we have to remember it is down to one family, Al Saud family, and the clergy that they're supporting.
Thank you very much. If there is no further questions, I would like to thank the Al-Baqee's organization for bringing this topic here today. I'd like to thank you all for participating, and we can maybe have a coffee and a drink at the back of the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.